So with the AYN Thor being a dual screen device, obviously we're going to want to run some dual screen emulators. So let's have a look at setting up Nintendo DS emulation on the AYN Thor. So for Nintendo DS games, we are going to be using an emulator called MelonDS. Now, just a note before we get started, this will only emulate DS and DSi games. 3DS will be done in a separate video because it is a completely different emulator. So we're going to go to Obtainium. If you don't have Obtainium, then be sure to check out my original video where I set up Obtainium. So you'll notice there's two emulators. There's MelonDS and there's MelonDualDS. There's also MelonDS Nightly for those who want to live on the edge and get the most up-to-date, potentially unstable versions. The difference between MelonDS and MelonDualDS, the original fork of MelonDS did not originally have dual screen support. So Sapphire Rhodonite created a different fork called MelonDualDS, which allowed us to take advantage of both screens. However, the original fork of MelonDS has since been updated, so MelonDualDS is obsolete, unfortunately. So what you can do in this instance is if you can tap into that, you can just delete MelonDualDS, because MelonDS will be the only one you need. So just like any other app from Obtainium, we're just going to download it and install it. And there we are. Now I've already got myself a game ready. We're going to be trying out some Pokemon Platinum. But before we shift the ROM over to the relevant folder, we're going to get MelonDS set up. So we're just going to open it up. We can set our ROM directory first. Unfortunately, this one doesn't have a full onboarding wizard, so we will have to go through it ourselves. If you're using the ESDE folder layout, then the folder you're looking for is NDS, which is here. But you can store it in a folder called Nintendo DS, however you want to store it. So firstly, we're going to go to these three dots on the top right. We're going to go to Settings, and we're just going to work our way through each of these settings options, and then we'll test out a game. So firstly, for General, for Theme, you can set Light or Dark mode. I just leave it on System Default. I'm a big fan of dark modes. For Fast Forward Max Speed, I like to set this on 4 times. If it's unlimited, if you're playing something like a Pokemon game or a JRPG, unlimited can be potentially way too fast. So I think 4 is a fast but not too fast. You can enable rewind if you like. As I've said in previous videos, I don't because of the way I play RetroAchievements. And then there's this little check for updates toggle here. However, Obtainium will handle updates for us, so you can leave this enabled, you can leave it disabled. That's entirely up to you. So for ROMs, we don't need to really touch any of this. So we've got our search directory at the top. Unfortunately, we can only have one inside MelonDS. However, if you're using a front end which has the capability to have multiple, then that will alleviate that issue, which we'll cover in future videos. For icon filtering, this is just how it looks on the home screen, and then just leave the ROM cache size at 1 GB, that's plenty. Okay, for save files, so you can have them just save next to the ROM file, but that will mean that your ROMs folder will end up full of save data. What I like to do is disable this, and then set my save file directory to my saves folder that I made a while ago. So inside here, I'm going to make a folder. I'm going to call it MelonDS. I always advise, if you're doing this kind of thing with save folders, like I showed in the RetroArch setup, is name them by the core or the emulator rather than the system, because it just makes things way easier to manage and it prevents any potential compatibility issues. So we're going to use that folder. You can also use the save state location. You can set it as the save file directory, the ROM directory, or internal. I'm just going to set this to internal because I don't really use save states like I've said before, but that is entirely up to you. Okay, going back to system, so we have some internal firmware. You can set a nickname, so I'm just going to set my name, Alex. You can set a message, don't really know what that's for. This is for if you boot into the internal firmware. You can also set your birthday. So mine is the 11th of October. Remember, I'm expecting good wishes. So you also want to make sure enable JIT is left ticked. So JIT is just in time. It's to do with how the compiler handles code execution. That's as technical as I'll get for that. It's pretty complex stuff, but it's fantastic. So for custom BIOS and firmware, you actually don't need to do anything with this, but if you like to, then you can use one of the firmwares we got on our RetroArch pack back in that video, and then that will enable you to boot into the actual DS's software. But for the most part, you don't really need to, unless you really want to have a play around. To do that, you just enable this. You can enable the boot screen if you like. You can set your system, whether that's DS or DSi, although do note that the DSi firmware is still in experimental stage. And then you can just set your BIOS directory to your BIOS folder and your system folder that we made in our original RetroArch video. So I'm just going to use that folder. So it hasn't found the DSi BIOS, which is fine. So it is missing the NAND, but we're not going to worry about that. So we'll leave this on for now, just show you how that looks like. We'll show the boot screen as well, because that's always nice. And then we'll back out. For video, so we want to change our renderer from software to OpenGL. Unfortunately, we don't have Vulkan, but this is still perfectly fine. Our native resolution, you want to get this as close to the resolution of the screen as possible. So for a 1080p screen, we'll go for 5 times native. You can add a filter if you like. You can have like an LCD filter, which makes it look more like the DS screen. There's all sorts of filters. Personally, I don't really use these because I think they can look a little bit cartoony at times. So I'm just going to leave those off, and that's all we need for video. Audio, you can enable a microphone source, so you can actually blow into the device microphone. So you can make sure you enable that whilst you're using the device. So the microphone is this tiny little hole here. It is a terrible quality microphone, but for interacting with DS games and things like that, it does the job. Now inputs, we're going to do our normal key mapping. So you'll see, looking at these, it's a little bit back to front. So looking at these, you can see they're a little bit back to front. We've got B for A, we've got A for B, and so on and so forth. So we're just going to tap these little X's. We're going to start from scratch. So we're going to set our A button, our B button, our X button, our Y button, left, right, up, down. Now for these, we can also map our analog stick to the same inputs. So we're going to do the exact same thing, left, right, up, down. So we can use either analog or the D-pad depending on your preference. They'll both trigger the same commands. For L and R, we'll use our bumpers. Start, select. So you can have options here as well to toggle the lid or pause the game. Within MelonDS, there is some little buttons as well that you can touch on the screen which do the same thing. So I just tend to use those rather than setting hotkeys. For fast forward, I'm going to use my right trigger, my R2, and then for swap screens, I'm going to use L2. This just basically swaps the top and bottom screen, which can be handy in certain games. And then you can set quick save, quick load, rewind, however you like. It is entirely your preference. So back in this input menu, you'll see this soft input opacity. So that's what I was talking about before, where there's little buttons that I'll show you shortly, and you can just set the opacity. So I'll show you it on the default for now, and then we can adjust it, hide it, but still have the functionality, and we'll see how we get on with that. Retro Achievements. You've probably heard me bang on about Retro Achievements before. Get an account, they're brilliant, they're completely free. So I'm just gonna log in. So now I'm logged in. Now I'm going to enable hardcore mode, which I've mentioned before. This basically gets you gold achievements on Retro Achievements, but it does disable cheats, save states, slow motion, and rewind. Entirely up to you if you enable or disable that, but if you're a proper gamer, you want to keep this ticked. And then you can just enable or disable notifications. I'm just going to leave those as is. Okay, for cheats, now I did do a whole video covering cheats, but basically we can enable cheats and then we can import a cheats database. So for the actual cheats XML file, there's a link here that I'll leave in the description below from gbatemp.net, credit to Dead Skull Juniors. And if we come down here to where it says spoiler download, we're going to click this mega link. We're going to just continue in the browser, and then inside the cheat databases folder, we're looking for the XML file here. We're going to press those 3 dots. We'll allow it. Okay. Press the 3 dots, and then we'll just download. It can take a moment because it is about a 125 meg file, so Mega will need to decrypt the download and then it'll just start downloading. Okay, so that's downloaded. So what we can do now is if we go back to MelonDS, we can import the cheats, we'll allow that, and then if we go to our downloads folder, and there we are. We just need to tap that file and it will start importing the cheats. So this will take a moment because there are a bajillion games in here. So now we're going to move our games over. So if we go back to our file explorer, so I've got a game already, I've got Pokemon Platinum. Now the good thing about MelonDS is in order to save space, we can just leave it inside the zip file, because if we go inside it, you'll see that it's 128 megabytes. However, the zip file is 48. So we've saved nearly 2/3 of space just by leaving it in the zip folder. What MelonDS will do is it will keep it in the zip folder and still be able to run it, which is extremely handy. So we're going to come over to our ROMs folder, then I'm going to press and hold, press my little scissors, and then just paste that over there. This is why I really like using Solid Explorer, because it's so much easier than using the stock file browser. Now that's in there, we're going to go back to MelonDS. We'll pull down from the top just to refresh it, and you can see we have Pokemon Platinum. So let's boot into it. If we turn that opacity really low and we boot the game, you can see that they're extremely faint, so they're not in the way. You can hide these completely and they'll still work. So you can see, because we've set our BIOS file, it's booted us into the actual DS firmware, and it thinks I'm Bill Nye for some reason, who I believe is a science guy. I'm not from the US, so he wasn't that big over here. So I can just tap into this and boot it. And there we are, we're in the game. So as I mentioned before, we have these little soft buttons. So we've got our close lid, which will treat the game as though the lid's closed. We can hide them by touching that. We can enable or disable our microphone, and we can fast forward, which I already set a key for. It's very loud, I'm just going to turn that down. So here we are, Pokemon Platinum with native dual screen, thanks to the great work of Sapphire Rhodonite and DualDS. So if we increase the opacity on those buttons and then we boot the game again, you can see that the buttons are a little bit more solid. So if you don't want to boot into the BIOS every time, then what we can do is we can press those 3 dots and we can just go to our system, and then we'll disable the custom BIOS. So now if we open it up, we boot straight into the game, so you don't have to go into the DS BIOS and then do it. So if we press our back button here, we also get access to our menu, so we can view our achievements, and then from there you can set a save state, you can customize the settings, or you can just exit the game from here. And there we are, that is DS emulation running on the AYN Thor. If this video helped you out, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe. Do make sure you stay tuned, because there are going to be plenty of AYN Thor setup guides for emulators, front ends, apps that I find online, all sorts of great stuff in the coming months. So see you next time.